I think the biggest risk now is if we don't start making it mandatory to energy model buildings, then we do have risks associated with things that are still not within the code or haven't been addressed. Things like ventilation, appropriate ventilation is probably a key one. Overheating, something that's been in the news.
Clima inspires and educates people to create healthy, durable and energy efficient buildings to live, learn, work and play in. Welcome to the Clima podcast. In this episode, I talked to Sian Taylor. Sian was one of New Zealand's first passive house designers and runs Team Green Architects along with Mark Reed. They are based in Queenstown. In this episode, we hear all about the journey to build her own passive house. Hi there, Sian. Welcome to the Clima podcast today. How are things in Queenstown?
Yeah, good. Thank you. It's another beautiful day.
Now, you grew up in Wales, didn't you?
Yep, I did.
What was it like growing up in Wales, and what was the house like that you lived in?
It's definitely different to here. There's lots of similarities growing up in Wales, but it's also very different. And probably one of the first things I did notice when I came to live here was just how different the house and the places that I was living were. So the house that I grew up in was a brick and block construction with a cavity filled with a fiberglass insulation. And it was a pretty modern house. It was actually built when I was 11 years old. I remember it being built for my parents. And it was quite a modern design. Ironically, I didn't realize this until recently, but it's actually quite a similar shape to the house we designed for ourselves, which obviously on some level it had sunk in. It's just a sort of predominantly mono-pitched roof, 2-story house. Yeah, and it had, as most houses in the UK, it had PVC windows, which meant you didn't get sort of cold around the windows and condensation, etc. But funnily enough, when we went back for Christmas just gone, and I always used to sit back and think that house was so warm relative to predominant New Zealand construction. Obviously, it was central heated. But this Christmas, and we did have a really cold spell, I realised that it's not a patch on the passive house that I'm now living in. So that was quite good to realise.
When you were growing up, how early on did you aspire to be an architect?
It was quite late for me. I think I always liked designing things. So we had a little caravan growing up, and I used to sit in this caravan. We used to go on holidays around Europe, and I used to sit in the caravan and try and redraw how the caravan could be better and design little spaces. And I liked designing, but it was only, I remember an early edition of Grand Designs and coming away watching it thinking, I want to be an architect. And that was actually, I'd already got into university to do maths and physics. And at the time I thought, I'll do maths and physics and then I'll do architecture. And then it dawned on me that meant I'd be at university for about 10 years, which was ridiculous. So I changed my mind and just did architecture.
But I see that it's still a BSc of architecture. Does that mean that you've got a maths and science sort of part to the degree?
No, that's just what it was. It was the same as the BAS that they do here, but for whatever reason, it's a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, and then you do a B-Arch, which is the part 2.
And then what prompted you to move over to New Zealand?
Well, I didn't move over here. I sort of ended up here. So it was the skiing that brought me. So I took some time out after university and traveled and then did a ski season in Europe. And the traveling was America and Australia, but then did ski season in Europe. And I remember coming back and knowing I had to go back to complete my architecture training, which was more time in practice and then take part 3 in the UK. So I knew I was going back into sort of a typical work environment, but just always remembered how much fun I'd had and how life didn't have to be that straight, sort of just follow one route. And that was a real conscious decision when I got back, thinking, okay, I'm not just going to do it the same way that everyone else does it. And then got a few years into working and was sort of at the point where, you're looking at your career path, like associate, and then, as you progress through a big firm. And I thought, I've got to make a break now. So my parents were coming over to New Zealand actually for a little holiday. And I thought, right, I'll go before they go, and came over for a 6 months break. And then they came to visit, and essentially I basically just stayed. So it was the skiing and the life and just doing something different. And the skiing, to be fair, when I first got here was a bit of a shock because there wasn't much on the internet when I booked to come over here. I think there was one photo of Queenstown that was the mall in full snow. So my assumption was, completely incorrectly, that it was like Europe, that you skied into the center of Queenstown and then you skied back out again. So when I arrived in June and there's like no snow on the ground, I thought, when does the snow start? And I was really confused. But yeah, it didn't take long before I loved it. And it was a great place to be. Like Queenstown in particular is just such a fun place to come. And that was, what was that? That was 2005. So about, 19 years ago. That's crazy.
Very similar timing to me. I moved over to Dubai and then came here also about 19 years ago. So,
wow.
So when you arrived here, what was the house like that you lived in over here?
When I landed, I went to stay with a friend who lived in Auckland, and it was June. So obviously it's a cold time of year. And he clearly remembered that night that they gave us a hot water bottle, and there was like a little electric heater that they pulled out to keep the room warm. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, that's a pity that my friend didn't get a particularly good house to live in. And it was a beautiful house. It was an old villa. It was beautiful. But I was thinking, it's a real pity that he's got a cold house. And, that's probably what it's like when you're renting. And then as I traveled across the country, and then obviously ended up here in Queenstown, and realized quite soon that that was just the way that people lived, and finding it really shocking. And also quite shocking because I had quite a few interviews with architects in the area before my first job, and realizing that I was talking about things like thermal bridges and depths of insulation, which was really key to what was happening in the UK. It was the start of step changing of the building code. So we were all having to wrap our heads around things like that. And it just wasn't part of anyone's discussion. And it was literally get as much insulation in as the room that's left. It was literally no thought about keeping a place warm. It was just, you're lucky if you get a bit of insulation in against whatever construction you've got.
So where did you hear about Passive House? What prompted you to start moving in that direction?
That was actually Paula Huggins, who I worked with. And before I worked with her, I got to know her, and she told me about it, and it sparked my interest. And as soon as I did the training, which I think two of us were the first architects to do it, which was back in, I think, 2011. Yeah, I just thought this is the way it's got to be. And it just suddenly all clicked into place and made sense. And there was sort of no turning back after that.
So you built your own passive house, and I've had a look at some of the photos. It looks pretty amazing. Tell us about that journey.
Well, we had to do it because, it's what we do for other people. And once you've done it enough, you realize you can't do anything else. So when we started the company and we were building this way or designing this way, we were living in a sort of 1980s single glazed, obviously aluminium windows, 90mm framing house on the side of Fern Hill in Queenstown, which is a south-facing hill. So absolutely stunning views. And my parents would visit in the summer and couldn't understand why we'd want to leave there, because it's just it was literally like glass and then lake and mountains. It was just beautiful. But obviously in the winter it was absolutely freezing. So we'd have ice inside our windows. A sort of house, which is often the case on the side of a hill, where you actually enter at the top story, and that was where the living space was. And then you go downstairs to the bedrooms below. So the top story was where you had the fireplace, which was the only source of heat in that house until we put some heaters in downstairs. So I used to come home, and I remember we had our daughter, and that was probably the breaking point, because I used to pick her up from daycare, come home in the winter, and it would be absolutely freezing. And the curtains had been drawn all day to try and keep some heat in. So this beautiful view you couldn't see through. And then if you did open the curtains, it was basically just condensation. And I would struggle to get the fire lit because I'd have a hungry daughter. And then, you'd get to a point, maybe 9 o'clock at night, where upstairs was finally warm, and you go downstairs to an ice pit. So we did all sorts of things to try and make that house warmer, but essentially there's a limit to what you can do without sort of overcapitalizing on a old house. Yeah, so we bought some land, and that was it. We just started designing, and designed somewhere very small because we'd probably spent most of our budget on a beautiful piece of land, and knew that we didn't need anything particularly too big, and designed a house which is essentially 2-story rectangle. And again, it's on the side of a hill, but in this case, we live downstairs, which is the area that faces the view. And then upstairs, we've got a separate entry to a separate flat, which is where I'm sitting now, which was going to be a flat and is now actually our office.
So you'd done the course, but how did you find putting that into practice? Did it come naturally, or was it quite a lot of learning still?
Once you learn the principles of it, it's pretty much common sense, really. It's just about making sure you've got a continuous thermal envelope. So you've got to, I suppose the trickiest thing, and the trickiest thing still in terms of detailing, is where you are potentially trying to achieve something in an architectural sense that isn't going to be simple from an insulation and an airtightness sense. So, for example, we've had a couple of situations, our Oliver's Ridge house, and we're doing one right now, which is similar, where we've got the geometry of the building. It's a flat roof building, and then the flat roof is so sort of more of a modernist style with a big projecting eave, which is obviously to stop too much sun coming into that building. It's a north-facing site, so we need a big overhang. And because it's a big house and there's a lot of structure in it, we've got big steel beams which run from inside to outside, and we've got a warm roof. So the roof is obviously on top of that. And that makes for a tricky detail, because you've either got to make it airtight along the edge of the building wall line and make that your thermal envelope, and then go in between joists to make it airtight up to the underside of the warm roof, or you've got to go all the way around that overhang and back, which in both cases is not an easy thing to do and to detail and to build. Obviously, if it's hard to detail, it's hard to build.
How do you find the balance between building something that's going to be comfortable and energy efficient with the budget side of things?
Well, it's just part of what we do, essentially. So I do get what you're saying in terms of the balance. If you haven't made a decision that that's what you're doing, then you're probably always weighing that up. But we decided early on that there's a certain standard that doesn't make sense to go below. So essentially what you're doing is looking at the budget, but those elements are part of it from the start. So it's kind of a bit like some things become expected as time goes on. Like, for example, when I first got here, we were designing houses that would be, a typical sort of 3-bedroom house would be a 3-bedroom house with a living, kitchen, dining room and a laundry. Now that expectation is for a 3-bedroom house with a snug, with a walk-in pantry. And it's just become the expectation because that's the way the market's gone. But obviously that makes a bigger house, and it means a more costly house. So it's the same thing, really. If the expectation is already there, then you just do it. And that's, I guess, how we look at making buildings energy efficient.
So there's a lot of talk about the changes to H1 and the new energy efficiency bill that's come in recently. What would you have to comment on those changes, and what might have been left out in those changes or improved?
Firstly, it's fantastic, and it was long overdue. I'm really glad that it happened, because a statistic that essentially says that by 2050, 2/3 of residential homes will be existing stock. So if we hadn't have made that change, then obviously that percentage would have been higher. And it's just a pity we didn't make it earlier, because the existing stock is obviously not as good as the newer stock, and that's always the case. I think we could have gone further, and it is frustrating that you get big players in the industry that push back and are against the change. I think the biggest risk now is if we don't start making it mandatory to energy model buildings, then we do have risks associated with things that are still not within the code or haven't been addressed. Things like ventilation, appropriate ventilation is probably a key one. Overheating, something that's been in the news last week, which is obviously going to be a problem. It's a problem that we encounter. Put it this way, it's not hard to keep a house warm if you adopt passive house principles, which, making a building airtight, putting good level of insulation in and avoiding thermal bridges. But if you're not addressing overheating and you're not aware of how much your building is overheating, then that is going to be a significant problem. And the other 2050 statistic I heard is that by 2050, 50% of greenhouse gases are going to be due to cooling of buildings. So it's essential that we look at the overheating, especially in places like Auckland where it's hot and humid, but it could be anywhere in the country. Essentially, if we've got too much glass in a direction that hasn't been shaded, so the sun's not been stopped from coming in when it's too hot, then the building's going to overheat.
What is the sort of level of comfort that you're experiencing now by living in a passive house, both in winter and summer?
I realised the other day that I've got a significant number of clothes that I just don't wear anymore. So the clothes that I used to put on in the winter to, go to work and just layer up essentially, just don't get worn because we're in t-shirts pretty much the whole time. And that's a big thing. And it's the same with our daughter. When she goes to school, I have to remind her that actually it's cold outside. So this time of year is probably when things start to change, and the temperature never changes in the house. We're never thinking about being hot or cold. Or if we do, that's not 100% true. There is times when it will get colder and it might be a few degrees, and you become really sensitive to smaller changes in temperature. So whereas we used to live in places where you literally get out of the shower and dread getting out of the shower because it'd be so cold. And, I just remember being in a house where you don't want to get dressed because it's just too cold to take your clothes off. We never have that going on, and you get used to that. And that's something, I guess, which makes me passionate about what I do, because everybody should be living like that. It shouldn't be just a few people. It's why this needs to be mandatory, or it needs to move towards this, so that everybody gets to experience living in a warm, comfortable house.
Totally, Sian. Now, you hear some people having concerns about living in a building that is airtight. What would you say to people that say, well, I want my indoor-outdoor flow and open the windows and things like that?
Actually, it still surprises me that that is a concern, because it's so unfounded. Essentially, you don't live any different in a passive house or an airtight house to you would in a non-airtight house. The only difference is that you're not having heat leaking out in ways that you don't want it to. So now we work upstairs in the separate flat, and we're home all the time. All year, as long as it's not a particularly cold day or raining or something, we've got doors and windows open all the time, like all day. So it's just not true. Like, there's nothing in that. You just don't live any differently. The difference is that you've got a building that's taking care of you, and you're not trying to take care of it by keeping it warm.
Another question we often get is that if you've got this ventilation system running the whole time, doesn't that cost a lot of electricity?
Yeah, well, that's not true either. The ventilation system is so low energy, and someone told me it's the energy of a light bulb. I don't know if that's true, but it's very low energy. And look, we will go away. We went away for 2 months over Christmas and left the ventilation system on. You just don't think about it. It just trickles away. It doesn't make any noise. It's no sort of blown air. It's just this thing that's going on in the background, making sure you've constantly got fresh air.
It is pretty amazing. I've actually just recently installed one in my own home, and I actually measured the power when it's running at the sort of low speed. It's only using 25 watts of electricity, which is literally half of a standard incandescent light bulb.
That's good to know.
And I'm quite amazed at watching the figures between the way that the heat is actually being recovered. Isn't it quite incredible? Because it can be quite cold outside, but the air from inside my house is actually preheating that air coming in, and it's actually just amazing to see the performance of it. I'm someone that really likes measuring things, so I've got all these sensors installed, and watching what's going on is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's great.
Sean, obviously, this is something that's only being done on a tiny fraction of homes at the moment in New Zealand. How do you think we can speak to people and get this message out to tell them about what could be done?
It's a really hard one because I think unless you experience the difference, there's always going to be a level of, I guess, firstly, not really understanding how it is different and how much better it is, but also that sort of level of misunderstanding that we just talked about in terms of, oh, well, what does airtight mean? And it sounds scary. It sounds completely contrary to what it is. And I think things like the mechanical ventilation can scare people too, because there's the thought that you're putting in extra services and systems, and that's one more thing I've got to take care of, and so on. And it's so different to what it is. Like if I think about how much I have to do around this house in terms of everyday activities around services, and maintenance, and it's completely different to the house I used to be in. So I never think about lighting a fire because we haven't got one. We've got one outside, which is brilliant because if we have friends around, and because we're in quite a small house, we'll often be outside around the fireplace. And, if you've got more than two friends, essentially we're basically all outside, and it means you're there under the stars enjoying being outside. And if we were in a much bigger house, you'd be coming inside because it might get cold, but instead you're outside around a fireplace, and you need a fireplace outside because it's cold. But when you come into the house, you don't need a fireplace because the house is warm and it's taking care of you. So it's things like that freedom and that understanding that unless you've lived it or experienced it is a difficult thing to get across. So I hopefully will get to that point with more and more buildings being built and people realizing. I think that's already starting to happen. But essentially, the main way to shift change has got to come from government level. And it's why, we've got these massive changes in Europe that have just happened where everything is moving this way. It already has been, but it's moving to passive house. And it's the only way that we can do it is affected at that level.
I was reading an interesting article, one of your blogs on your website, where you talk about the cost of heating a home. Obviously, Queenstown gets pretty cold. And I think you were talking about a 150 square meter house to heat an old house that was obviously built, 20, 30 years ago, might be in the region of $7,000 or $8,000 a year, where versus a passive house being $600 for a year. What have you found in your own home since you've lived there?
In the summer, we have got PV on the roof, but in the summer, we're getting payback. So we're not paying anything. And then in the winter, I think I was surprised one month that we had a power bill that was around $300. But I'm aware that we're living and working at home. We've got several computers and a server in the house. So we've got other systems in this building. But yeah, you don't think about the cost of power, essentially. I'm never thinking about the cost of power, which is very contrary to, for example, my in-laws' house in winter is just, they cannot run the heating system. They can't run the in-slab system because it's just too expensive. It will cost them over $1,000 per month easily if they put the heating on. So they're just living in a freezing cold house.
That's pretty sad, Sean. So I think, as you say, it's about somehow trying to lobby government so that we can get everyone living in this sort of standard, isn't it?
It is. It's got to come from there. And there's so many statistics that mean it makes sense. There was a statistic which was if you look at it financially across all the departments of what it would affect in terms of the health of people and the amount of people that are dying each year in terms of living in cold, damp houses, which was huge. It's bigger than the number of people that die on the roads each year, but we just let it happen and we don't focus on it, which is awful. So there's a 6-to-1 benefit financially to doing this, and yet we're still not doing it. So the more things like that can be put in front of government, obviously if the government is interested in climate change, which not every government is, then they're going to look at it, because it's the only way that we can start moving towards the carbon targets that we need to affect. 60% of energy use over the life cycle of a building is due to operational energy in a typical New Zealand house. And that's a house above code. That's what I learned from Jason from Sustainable Engineering this week. So until we bring that down to passive house level, that's the only point where you actually start to equate the embodied carbon and the operational carbon. So we essentially have to bring down that operational carbon, and it means warmer, more comfortable houses for people. So it's a benefit for the planet, it's a benefit for the people living in them, and it means healthier houses, healthier people. So it's benefit for the economy as well.
Thank you very much for your time. We're sort of running to the end of the interview now, but thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to catching up with you someday in person.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
Sharing knowledge is at the heart of our strategy to make buildings better for everyone. Sign up for our podcasts to learn more about creating healthy living conditions by protecting building structures from external and internal moisture damage. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to having you with us next time.